London, May 1817. The morning arrived cold and grey, as though even the heavens understood the nature of what was about to transpire within the small family chapel of the Whitmore residence. Eleanor Whitmore stood before the modest altar in a borrowed wedding gown that hung slightly loose at the shoulders, the ivory silk chosen for someone else's figure, someone else's joy. At 24 years of age, she had long since accepted the truth that mirrors and society whispered with equal cruelty. She was plain. Her features were unremarkable, her figure neither graceful nor particularly feminine. Her hair a mousy brown that refused to curl fashionably no matter how her maid labored. She possessed no beauty to recommend her, no charm that might compensate for her unfortunate face. Nothing but her father's money and the desperate circumstances that had brought her to this moment. Beside her stood Lord Christopher Ashworth, Earl of Ashworth, a man she had met exactly twice before this morning. He was handsome in the severe way of marble statuary, all sharp angles and cold perfection, his jaw tight throughout the brief ceremony, as though he were enduring rather than celebrating. His eyes, a striking grey that might have been beautiful in a softer context, remained distant and hard, fixed on some point beyond the minister's head. Eleanor felt the wrongness of it in her bones, the way his voice clipped through his vows with barely restrained anger, the way he did not look at her even once as he spoke words that should have been tender. She knew what this was. Her father's business troubles had mounted through the winter like drifting snow, silent and suffocating, until Victor Whitmore had come to her with that particular expression men wear when they are about to spend their daughters like currency. She was being sold, bartered, traded for financial relief and social elevation her father craved. That Lord Ashworth, young and wealthy and titled, had agreed to this match at all, mystified her until she saw his face and understood. He did not want her. He wanted something from her father, some business arrangement that required this legal binding. Behind them, the few guests her father had assembled whispered with voices that carried in the stone chapel like wind through cracks. A mismatch, they murmured. Such a plain girl for such a handsome lord. How desperate must Whitmore be? How peculiar that the Earl agreed, the scandal of the rushed arrangement. Eleanor held herself very still, spine straight, chin level, refusing to bow under the weight of their judgment. She had learned dignity early, that particular armor of the unwanted. When Christopher finally slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch was brief and cold as January frost, and Eleanor Whitmore became Eleanor Ashworth, Countess of Ashworth, a title that felt like a cage rather than a crown, knowing with absolute certainty that she was unloved, unwanted, nothing more than a transaction sealed with empty vows and a gold band that sat heavy as chains upon her hand. The wedding breakfast proved even more excruciating than the ceremony itself. A small gathering of relatives and business associates assembled in the Whitmore dining room, where conversation moved in stilted bursts around Eleanor and Christopher's nearly complete silence. They sat beside each other at the table's head, so close their sleeves nearly touched, yet separated by a chasm of cold intention that Eleanor could feel like winter air seeping through walls. Christopher spoke only when directly addressed, his responses clipped and formal, and he did not look at her even once during the interminable meal. Eleanor picked at her food without appetite, performing the motions expected of a bride while her mind circled the questions she could not answer. Why had he agreed to this match? What did he want from her father? How long would she have to endure this frozen politeness that passed for marriage? The answer came not from him, but from the careless voices of two of her father's business partners who had stepped just beyond the doorway into the hall, their words carrying back through the opening with cruel clarity. She heard Christopher's name, then her father's, then the story that made her blood turn cold in her veins. 10 years prior, Victor Whitmore had entered into a business arrangement with the late Earl of Ashworth, Christopher's father, a joint venture that Whitmore had systematically undermined through fraudulent accounting and deliberately concealed losses, leaving the elder Lord Ashworth responsible for debts that destroyed him financially and socially. The shame and stress had killed him within a year, leaving his son to rebuild from ruins. And now, the voices continued with something like admiration for the cleverness of it. Young Lord Ashworth had taken his revenge in the most elegant way imaginable, by marrying Whitmore's only child, taking away the one thing the merchant valued beyond money, the one vessel for his social ambitions, and condemning her to a lifetime of misery as the unwanted wife of an earl who despised everything she represented. Eleanor sat very still as the words penetrated like knives, each revelation a fresh wound. She was not merely unwanted, she was hated, a tool of vengeance, the instrument through which Christopher would punish her father by ensuring his daughter lived in lonely misery within a cold marriage. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she folded them tightly together, willing herself to maintain composure, to give no one the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she finally dared glance at Christopher, she found his profile rigid as carved stone, his jaw set, and she understood with sinking certainty that he had heard the conversation as well, that he knew she now knew the truth, and that he did not care. The journey to Ashworth Manor unfolded in nearly complete silence, the carriage rolling through countryside that might have been beautiful had Eleanor possessed any capacity to notice. Christopher stared out the opposite window, his face averted, and Eleanor looked at her hands, at the golden ring that marked her as his property, and felt her heart compound its breaking. When the manor finally came into view, a grand stone edifice set among ancient trees, Eleanor recognized it for what it was, her prison, beautiful and cold. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, a woman of perhaps 50 years with kind eyes and a gentle manner, greeted them in the entrance hall, and Eleanor saw something in her expression that looked remarkably like sympathy, as though she already understood exactly what manner of marriage had just arrived at her door. Mrs. Dalton led Eleanor up the wide staircase with its faded runner, down a long corridor where portraits of Ashworth ancestors stared from shadowed frames, and finally to a set of double doors at the far end of the east wing. "The Countess's chambers," Mrs. Dalton explained with gentle formality, though Eleanor detected sadness beneath the words. When the housekeeper opened the doors, Eleanor stepped into rooms that had clearly stood empty for years, dust motes swirling in the grey afternoon light that filtered through tall windows, holland covers draped over furniture like ghosts, the air itself feeling stale and neglected. Christopher's mother had died 8 years prior, Mrs. Dalton offered quietly, and his lordship had kept these rooms closed since then, unable to bear the memories. Eleanor nodded, understanding in that moment that she was not the first woman to suffer in this house, that grief and loss had marked these walls long before her arrival. Mrs. Dalton promised to have the rooms cleaned and aired immediately, but Eleanor barely heard her, already feeling the weight of inhabiting a dead woman's space, of being the unwanted replacement in every possible way. When the housekeeper finally withdrew, Eleanor stood alone in the dimness and let herself feel the full measure of her situation, the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless winter. She had just begun to remove her travelling cloak when the door opened without ceremony, and Christopher entered, his face still holding that same cold severity it had worn all day. He did not soften as he looked at her, did not pretend kindness or concern. He informed her with clipped formality that he expected nothing from this marriage beyond her physical presence, that she would have every material comfort but should harbour no illusions about affection or companionship, that his revenge was satisfied simply by having taken her from her father and installing her in this lonely exile where she would live out her days as the unwanted Countess of Ashworth. Eleanor listened with her hands folded before her, maintaining the dignity that had become her shield. And when he finished, she met his eyes with quiet steadiness and told him with a voice that did not shake that he need not worry, she would not beg for affection. She knew did not exist, would not burden him with expectations he had no intention of meeting, would trouble him as little as possible while fulfilling whatever obligations her position required. Something flickered in his expression then, surprise perhaps, or possibly the faintest edge of discomfort, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He nodded once, turned on his heel, and left without another word, the door closing behind him with hollow finality. Eleanor stood motionless for a long moment, then crossed to the door and very deliberately turned the key in the lock, the metallic click echoing in the silent room. It was a small thing, locking that door, but it was hers. The one choice she could make, the one space she could control in this prison of a marriage. That night, after Mrs. Dalton had supervised a whirlwind of cleaning and brought her a simple supper on a tray, after the fire had been lit and the worst of the dust banished, Eleanor lay in the great canopied bed that had belonged to Christopher's mother and stared at the ceiling while silent tears slid down her temples into her hair. She had not hoped for love, had never been foolish enough to dream of romance, but she had not anticipated this active coldness, this deliberate cruelty of being told explicitly that she was nothing more than an instrument of revenge. In the corridor outside, though Eleanor did not know it, Christopher stood with his hand raised toward her daughter, jaw clenched, and something uncomfortable twisting in his chest that might have been guilt, or might have been the first crack in the wall of anger he had built around his heart. He stood there for several minutes, wrestling with impulses he could not name, then finally lowered his hand and walked away to his own chambers, telling himself he felt nothing, that everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned, even as sleep eluded him until the grey hours before dawn. The days settled into a pattern as rigid and cold as winter frost, each one nearly identical to the last, marked only by the slow procession of hours that Eleanor navigated with careful dignity. She woke early each morning in the Countess's chambers, dressed with the help of a young maid named Annie, who had begun to show genuine affection toward her new mistress, and spent her mornings exploring the vast manor that was now her home, discovering neglected rooms filled with shrouded furniture and faded grandeur that spoke of better days when warmth and life had filled these corridors. She found a music room with a pianoforte sadly out of tune, a conservatory where broken panes had allowed weather to damage exotic plants that must once have been magnificent, and countless other spaces that seemed to wait for someone to notice them, to care about them, to bring them back to usefulness. Eleanor asked Mrs. Dalton for cleaning supplies and permission to restore what she could, and the housekeeper agreed with an expression of relief, as though she had been hoping someone would finally attend to the decay. Christopher avoided her with what seemed like deliberate effort, taking his breakfast before she came down, disappearing into his study, or riding out across the estate on business that kept him occupied until evening. And though they shared a formal dinner each night in the vast dining room, he sat at the far end of the long table and responded to her attempts at polite conversation with answers so brief and cold that Eleanor soon stopped trying, eating in silence while servants moved like shadows around them, and the distance between husband and wife seemed to grow even as they occupied the same space. The staff, however, began to warm to Eleanor, in ways that provided small comfort against the larger loneliness, Mrs. Dalton speaking to her with increasing gentleness, the maids smiling when she thanked them for their service, the footman bowing with what seemed like genuine respect rather than mere duty, and Eleanor understood that her kindness stood in sharp contrast to Christopher's brooding coldness, that they pitied her and admired her dignity in equal measure. Each night she climbed the stairs to her chambers as the house settled into darkness, entered the rooms that had become her sanctuary and her prison, and turned the key in the lock with fingers that trembled slightly, despite her determination to remain strong, that small act of defiance and self-protection, the only control she possessed in a life that had been entirely determined by others. And each night, though Eleanor did not know it yet, Christopher found himself drawn to her corridor as though pulled by invisible threads, standing outside her locked door in the shadows with his hand raised and his jaw clenched, wrestling with feelings he could not name and did not want to examine. Guilt, perhaps, or regret, or something even more unsettling that whispered he had made a terrible mistake. Mrs. Dalton saw him there one night as she made her final rounds, saw the Earl of Ashworth standing like a penitent outside his own wife's door, and she said nothing, but filed the observation away with knowing eyes that had seen much in her years of service, understanding that something was shifting in this house, that revenge was a cold companion and loneliness a harsh teacher, and that the pattern now established could not hold forever without something breaking. The second week of Eleanor's marriage began with grey skies that matched the bleakness of her days, and on Tuesday morning she woke with purpose forming despite her loneliness, deciding that she would walk to the tenant cottages at the far edge of the estate to introduce herself properly to the families who lived there, wanting to fulfill at least some useful function as countess, even if her husband had no interest in her as a wife. Mrs. Dalton warned her that rain threatened, and perhaps she should wait for better weather, but Eleanor insisted with gentle stubbornness that had begun to characterize her navigation of this cold household, wrapping herself in a cloak and setting out across the meadows with a basket of preserves and small necessities she thought might be welcome. The cottages were further than she had estimated, and the rain began before she was halfway there. Cold drops that quickly became a downpour, soaking through her cloak and chilling her to the bone. But Eleanor pressed forward out of sheer determination, visiting 3 families who received her with surprised gratitude, before she finally turned back toward the manor, shivering violently and feeling the cold settling deep into her chest. By the time she reached Ashworth Manor, she could barely climb the front steps, and Annie gasped in alarm when she saw her mistress dripping and pale, helping her upstairs and into dry clothes, while Mrs. Dalton was summoned and clucked over her with motherly concern that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, because it had been so long since anyone had worried over her welfare. That evening, Eleanor did not come down to dinner, and Mrs. Dalton informed Christopher with careful neutrality that her ladyship had taken ill after walking in the rain to visit his tenants, was feverish, and had been put to bed. And Christopher responded with coldness that it was none of his concern if his wife chose to behave foolishly, turning back to his correspondence as though the matter was entirely trivial. But throughout the evening, he found his attention wandering from the estate documents before him, found himself listening for sounds from the floor above, found excuses to walk past Mrs. Dalton and ask with studied casualness whether there was any change in her ladyship's condition, and the housekeeper's knowing eyes told him she saw right through his pretense of indifference, even as she answered that the fever was rising and perhaps the doctor should be sent for in the morning. When night fell, Christopher told himself he would not go to Eleanor's door, that her illness was her own fault and no responsibility of his, but his feet carried him up the stairs and down the corridor as they had every night since their wedding. And this time, when he stood outside her locked door, he heard something that froze his blood, the sound of Eleanor moaning in feverish delirium, her voice high and frightened, calling out words he could not quite distinguish. For the first time since their wedding night, he knocked on her door, softly at first, and then more urgently, calling her name with rising panic when she did not answer, hearing only those terrible moans that spoke of suffering beyond her control. He called her name again, louder now, propriety forgotten in sudden fear. And when still there was no response but that anguished sound, he made his decision in an instant, stepping back and throwing his shoulder against the door, forcing the lock with a crack of splintering wood that seemed to echo through the sleeping house. The door swung open, and Christopher stumbled into the darkened room, lit only by dying embers in the fireplace. And there, in the great canopied bed, lay Eleanor, her face flushed with fever, and her hair damp with perspiration, unconscious and burning with a heat he could feel even before he reached her side. And in that moment, Christopher understood with perfect clarity that he had been a fool, that revenge was a cold and bitter thing, and that the woman lying helpless before him mattered in ways he had refused to acknowledge until faced with the possibility of losing her entirely. Christopher stood frozen beside Eleanor's bed for only a moment before his paralysis broke, and he turned to shout for Mrs. Dalton, his voice echoing through the manor with an urgency that brought the housekeeper running in her nightclothes, her eyes widening when she saw the splintered door and her master kneeling beside his unconscious wife. "Send for Dr. Pemberton immediately," Christopher ordered. "I do not care that it is the middle of the night. Tell him the Countess is gravely ill, and I will pay whatever he asks." And while the housekeeper hurried away to dispatch a footman, Christopher turned back to Eleanor, pulling a chair close to her bedside and taking up a cloth to dampen with water from the pitcher, pressing it gently against her burning forehead, while his mind raced with fear he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Not since his father had fallen ill, and Christopher had watched helplessly as the man wasted away under the weight of shame and ruin. Eleanor moaned again and turned her head restlessly on the pillow, her lips moving to form words that came in fragments, whispers about being unwanted and invisible and alone, about fathers who saw daughters only as commodities and husbands who looked through wives as though they were made of glass. And Christopher felt each word like a blade turning in his chest, because he understood with terrible clarity that he had done this, that his deliberate cruelty had wounded this innocent woman who had never harmed anyone, who had walked through rain to bring comfort to his tenants while he sat in his study, nursing bitterness like a treasure. The doctor arrived within the hour. A grey-haired man who examined Eleanor with practiced efficiency while Christopher stood by feeling utterly useless, watching as Dr. Pemberton checked her pulse and listened to her breathing and frowned with concern that made Christopher's hands clench into fists. "It is a severe fever," the doctor pronounced, "likely from exposure to cold and damp. Her lungs are congested, and the next day or two will be critical. You must keep her cool with damp cloths, make her drink water whenever she is conscious enough to swallow, and send for me if the fever spikes higher or if she has difficulty breathing." Christopher nodded tersely and showed the doctor out with promises of payment and gratitude, then returned to Eleanor's bedside and resumed his vigil, dampening the cloth again and again as the night stretched toward dawn. Listening to her delirious murmurs that revealed the loneliness of her life, the resignation with which she had accepted being unloved, the quiet dignity she maintained even in the privacy of her own thoughts. As pale light began to filter through the windows, Eleanor's fever finally broke, her skin cooling beneath his hand and her breathing easing into something more natural. And when her eyes fluttered open just after dawn and focused with confusion on Christopher sitting beside her bed, still in his evening clothes and exhausted from his night of watching, he saw the question in her gaze, the bewilderment at finding him there, and he could not bear to answer it, could not explain what he did not yet understand himself. So he simply stood abruptly and left the room without a word, leaving Eleanor staring after him in weak confusion while something fundamental shifted in the foundation of his carefully constructed revenge. Eleanor recovered slowly over the following week, regaining her strength in careful increments while confined to her chambers under Mrs. Dalton's watchful care, and during those days of recuperation she found herself puzzling over the mystery of Christopher's presence at her bedside, trying to understand why a man who had married her for revenge would force open her locked door and spend the night tending her fever with his own hands. When she was finally well enough to leave her rooms and resume taking meals in the dining room, she discovered that something had shifted in the careful architecture of their cold coexistence. For Christopher no longer took his breakfast early to avoid her, or made excuses to dine in his study, but instead appeared at meal times with regularity that suggested intention rather than coincidence. The first morning she came down to breakfast. He rose when she entered, an automatic courtesy that seemed to surprise him as much as her, and after she was seated, he asked with awkward formality how she was feeling, whether she had slept well, if the doctor's tonic was helping her lingering cough. Eleanor answered cautiously, uncertain what to make of this new attention, studying his face for signs of mockery or ulterior purpose, but finding only what appeared to be genuine concern mixed with discomfort, as though he was navigating unfamiliar territory without a map. The questions continued over subsequent meals, stilted inquiries about her activities and health that she responded to with careful politeness, and gradually Eleanor began to notice other changes as well, small shifts in Christopher's behavior that accumulated into a pattern she did not dare interpret, for fear of being wrong. He began to linger after dinner, rather than retreating immediately to his study, sitting across from her in the drawing room while she embroidered, and he pretended to read. The silence between them no longer quite so hostile. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not decipher, his eyes following her movements as she arranged flowers in the hall or spoke kindly to the housemaid, and when she met his gaze, he would look away quickly as though caught at something he should not be doing. He noticed things about her that surprised her with their specificity, commenting that she took her tea with honey, but no milk, that she favored the blue morning room because it received the best light, that she had a habit of humming softly when she thought herself alone. These observations felt oddly intimate, coming from a man who had barely spoken to her for weeks, and Eleanor did not know whether to be pleased or unsettled by this evidence that Christopher had been paying attention when she believed herself invisible to him. Still, despite these small softenings, she continued to lock her bedroom door each night, the habit now both protection and principle, a last fortress of autonomy in a life where she had so little control. And still, though she did not know it, Christopher continued his nightly vigil outside that locked door. Standing in the darkened corridor with his hand raised toward the wood, wanting to knock, but unable to find words adequate to the apology he owed her, unable to justify asking for forgiveness when he had given her every reason to despise him. What would he say if she opened the door and found him there? What right did he have to ask for anything from her after the cruelty of his revenge? So he stood in silence and wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, then returned to his own cold chambers, while Eleanor lay awake on the other side of the locked door, wondering what her husband wanted from her now, and afraid to hope it might be anything more than the easing of his conscience. Eleanor discovered the library on a grey afternoon nearly a month after her wedding, wandering through rooms she had not yet fully explored, and finding herself drawn to a set of double doors she had assumed led to another drawing room, only to step inside and catch her breath at the sight of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books, more books than she had ever seen outside of her brief visits to lending libraries in London, the rich smell of leather and paper and dust filling her senses with a comfort she had not felt since arriving at Ashworth Manor. She moved along the shelves with reverent fingers trailing over spines, reading titles in philosophy and poetry and history, finding well-worn volumes of Shakespeare beside pristine editions of contemporary novels, evidence of a reader whose tastes ranged widely and whose love of books matched her own, and she was so absorbed in her exploration that she did not hear the door open behind her or notice Christopher's presence until his voice broke the silence with a question that made her jump and spin around guiltily as though caught stealing. "Do you read?" he asked, and the question held such genuine curiosity rather than mockery that Eleanor found herself answering honestly instead of retreating behind polite deflection, telling him, yes, she had always loved books. They had been her companions through a lonely childhood, and her escape from a house where affection was rationed and worth was measured only in currency. Christopher moved closer, his eyes scanning the shelf where she stood, and asked what she liked to read, and so began a conversation unlike any they had shared before, tentative at first but gaining confidence. As they discovered shared favourites and debated the merits of various authors, Eleanor's intelligence and insight revealing themselves in ways that clearly surprised Christopher, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine engagement as she quoted passages from memory and offered interpretations that challenged his own. When she mentioned loving the essays of Mary Wollstonecraft, he looked at her with something approaching respect, remarking that he had not expected to find a woman in his own house who had read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, much less agreed with its arguments, and Eleanor felt a spark of defiance kindle as she met his gaze and told him there was quite a lot about her he had not bothered to discover, that he had judged her based on her father's sins and her unremarkable face without ever asking who she actually was beneath those surface judgments. The words hung between them with more honesty than she had intended, and she watched emotions flicker across Christopher's face too quickly to identify before he quoted softly from a poem by William Cowper that she loved, the lines about variety being the very spice of life that gives it all its flavour, and their eyes met with sudden recognition of a shared language, a connection forged through words and ideas rather than the cold transaction of their marriage. For a moment something tender flickered in Christopher's expression, and Eleanor felt her heart betray her with hope. But then he seemed to catch himself, and the walls came back up as he stepped away and excused himself with awkward formality, leaving her alone among the books with her pulse racing and confusion swirling through her thoughts. That night, when Christopher stood outside her locked door, as had become his unwanted habit, he raised his hand to knock as he did every night, but this time he whispered her name so quietly that Eleanor inside could not hear it, could not know that he stood there wrestling with the realization that his wife was not the empty vessel he had imagined, but a woman of depth and intelligence and quiet strength, and that his revenge had entrapped them both in ways he was only beginning to understand. Eleanor discovered the rose garden on a morning when pale sunlight struggled through grey clouds, finding herself drawn to a walled enclosure at the eastern edge of the manor grounds that she had glimpsed from her bedroom window, but not yet explored, and when she pushed open the weathered wooden gate, she found herself standing in what must once have been a place of considerable beauty, but had fallen into melancholy neglect, with overgrown bushes tangled among themselves and flower beds choked with weeds and climbing roses gone wild across crumbling trellises. Something about the garden's abandoned state called to her own sense of being overlooked and forgotten, and she found herself returning day after day with gardening gloves borrowed from the groundskeeper and shears that felt awkward in her unpracticed hands, teaching herself through trial and error how to prune back the dead wood and clear space for new growth, losing herself in the physical work that quieted her confused thoughts about Christopher and the strange thawing that seemed to be occurring between them. What she did not know was that Christopher watched her from the window of his study, standing each afternoon with documents forgotten in his hands while his eyes followed her movements among the roses, remembering how his mother had loved that garden and spent hours there in the years before illness took her, how she had taught him the names of every variety and shown him how to deadhead the spent blooms to encourage new flowers, and seeing Eleanor now bringing care and attention to that neglected space stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to tenderness. On the 5th day of Eleanor's solitary gardening work, Christopher found himself walking out to the garden as though his feet had decided without consulting his mind, and Eleanor looked up in surprise when his shadow fell across the bed where she knelt pulling weeds, her face flushed from exertion and dirt smudged across her cheek in a way that made her look younger and less guarded than he had yet seen her. He stood there awkwardly for a moment before offering curt advice about pruning techniques, pointing out which canes were dead and which merely dormant, and Eleanor listened with quiet attention before returning to her work, while Christopher remained standing there, uncertain whether to leave or stay. After a long silence, he knelt beside her and began working on a particularly tangled bush, and they labored side by side without speaking until Eleanor finally asked tentatively if this had been his mother's garden, and Christopher felt words rising in his throat that he had not spoken to anyone in the years since his mother's death, telling Eleanor how his mother had created this garden during his childhood, and how it had been her refuge from the social demands of being a countess, how she had been happiest here with dirt under her fingernails and roses in her hair. Eleanor listened without interrupting or offering empty platitudes, her silence somehow more comforting than sympathy would have been, and Christopher found himself sharing the memory of his mother's final days when she had asked to be carried out to see her roses one last time, how she had died 3 days later with petals scattered across her coverlet. When he finally stopped speaking, he realized his hands were shaking and that Eleanor had moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture of such simple compassion that it threatened to undo him completely, and he found himself lingering there long after the work was done, reluctant to break the fragile connection that had formed between them in the quiet afternoon among his mother's forgotten roses. The letter arrived on a morning when early summer had finally broken through the grey skies that seemed to perpetually hang over Ashworth Manor, delivered by a rider who wore the distinctive livery of the Whitmore household and who departed quickly as though reluctant to linger in a place where the master's presence carried such weight. Eleanor had been working in the rose garden when Mrs. Dalton brought the letter to her. The housekeeper's expression concerned as she handed over the sealed paper, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop even before she broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet covered in her father's angular handwriting. The words were brief and brutal in the way only Victor Whitmore could manage, blaming Eleanor for her failure to soften her husband's heart toward the business difficulties that had befallen him, accusing her of selfishness and ingratitude after all he had sacrificed to secure her such an advantageous marriage, reminding her with cruel precision that her plain face and lack of charm had made her unmarriageable to anyone but a man seeking revenge, and that she owed him her dutiful intervention on his behalf. Eleanor read the letter twice, each word landing like a blow, before her hands began to tremble and tears she could not control spilled down her cheeks, and she sank onto the stone bench among the roses she had so carefully tended, while the letter fluttered from her numb fingers to the ground beside her feet. She did not hear Christopher approach or know how long he had been standing there before he spoke her name with such concern that she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she could not read, and when he asked what had distressed her, she could not find words to answer, but merely shook her head while tears continued to fall. Christopher picked up the letter, and Eleanor watched his face darken as he read, watched his jaw tighten and his hands clench around the paper hard enough that it crumpled in his grip. But when he looked at her again, the anger in his eyes was not directed at her, but at the man who had written such cruelty to his own daughter. He sat beside her on the bench and spoke with a gentleness she had never heard from him before, telling her that she was not responsible for her father's sins, that she owed Victor Whitmore nothing, that the man who could write such words to his daughter was unworthy of her loyalty or her tears. Eleanor stared at Christopher in surprise, searching his face for mockery or manipulation, and finding only sincerity and something that looked almost like tenderness, and she felt hope kindle dangerously in her chest, even as she tried to guard against it. That evening, Christopher walked her to her chambers, as had become their habit. And when she reached for the door handle, he stopped her with a soft knock against the wood frame, asking if he might speak with her, and Eleanor felt her heart racing as she told him through the locked door that she was tired, and perhaps they could speak tomorrow. She heard him rest his forehead against the door, and his voice came muffled but clear as he said the words that would change everything between them, telling her he was sorry for everything, that he had been wrong. And Eleanor stood with her back pressed against the other side of that locked door, and wept silently while her wounded heart dared to imagine that perhaps redemption was possible after all. The apology spoken through the locked door changed something fundamental between them. And in the days that followed, Christopher began actively seeking Eleanor's company in ways that felt both deliberate and tentative, as though he were learning a new language and feared making mistakes that might shatter the fragile connection forming between them. He found her in the rose garden one morning and asked if she would care to ride out with him to see the estate grounds, and though Eleanor hesitated for a moment, she saw something in his expression that was neither demand nor manipulation, but genuine invitation. So she agreed, and found herself an hour later seated on a gentle mare, while Christopher guided them along paths that wound through meadows and woodland that comprised his family's holdings. He showed her places that had mattered to him as a boy, pointing out the stream where he had learned to fish with his father before bitterness had consumed the man, the ancient oak where he had built a tree house that still clung to the branches in rotting defiance of time and weather, the hill from which one could see all the way to the village and beyond to the grey line of distant mountains. As they rode, Christopher began speaking about his father's decline in ways he had not articulated before, describing how the man had transformed from a loving parent into someone consumed by rage and shame after Victor Whitmore's fraud had destroyed his business reputation and left him unable to meet obligations to investors who had trusted the family name, how Christopher had watched helplessly as his father drank himself into an early grave while his mother wept silently and tried to maintain dignity in the face of social disgrace. Eleanor listened with the same quiet compassion she had shown in the garden, and when Christopher finally fell silent, she found herself sharing her own memories of a childhood spent trying to earn affection from a father who viewed her only as a commodity, to be eventually traded for advantage, who had made clear from her earliest awareness that her lack of beauty was a disappointment that she could only redeem through an advantageous marriage, who had never once told her she was loved or valued beyond her potential utility. They discovered in that long afternoon of riding and talking that their wounds came from different sources but left similar scars, that they both knew what it meant to be used by fathers who should have protected them, and this recognition created a bridge between them that began to span the distance that revenge and hurt had built. When they returned to the manor, Eleanor realized she was smiling, and Christopher was looking at her with an expression that made her heart skip in ways that felt dangerous and hopeful in equal measure. That evening they dined together, and conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before, and when Christopher said something about his childhood mishaps, Eleanor laughed with genuine amusement and saw his face light up as though her laughter was a gift he had not expected to receive. Later, when he walked her to her chambers, she felt the familiar tension return as her hand reached for the door handle. And though Christopher bid her good night with more warmth than he had ever shown, she still locked the door behind her, because trust was not built in a single day, and her heart was not yet ready to risk itself completely. But as she lay in the darkness, she found herself thinking that perhaps someday that lock might turn, and the door might open, and the man who had married her for revenge might become someone she could truly love. The village fair arrived with the first true warmth of summer, announced by colourful banners strung between the ancient oaks that lined the common green, and by the excited chatter of tenants who had been preparing for weeks. And when Eleanor mentioned at breakfast that she hoped to attend Christopher, surprised her by offering to accompany her without the stiffness that had characterized his earlier attempts at civility. They rode together in the open carriage, with the sun warm on their faces, and arrived to find the green transformed into a festival of color and sound, with booths selling ribbons and sweets, children running with hoops and kites, musicians playing lively country tunes, and the whole village seemingly gathered in celebration of the season and each other. Eleanor felt her spirits lift in ways they had not since before her marriage, and Christopher watched as she moved through the crowd with natural warmth, stopping to admire a farmer's wife's preserves, complimenting a young girl's embroidered handkerchief, laughing with genuine delight at a puppet show that had attracted a cluster of children. The villagers who had viewed their mismatched marriage with gossip and speculation now saw them together and noticed the contrast between Eleanor's open kindness and Christopher's reserved formality. But they also noticed that the Earl stayed close to his wife, and that his eyes followed her with an expression that had not been present in the early weeks, when rumors of his coldness had spread through the countryside. A group of children recognized Eleanor from her visits to the tenant cottages and flocked to her with the unself-conscious affection of the young, pulling at her skirts and begging her to watch them play. And Eleanor laughed with such freedom and joy that Christopher felt something shift in his chest as he watched her. She knelt in the grass, heedless of her dress, to admire a little girl's doll, her face alight with warmth and pleasure, and in that moment Christopher saw clearly what he had been blind to in his bitterness and revenge, saw that true beauty had nothing to do with the regularity of features or the fashion of appearance, but radiated from within, from kindness and compassion and the generous spirit that Eleanor possessed in abundance. She glanced up and caught him watching her, and something in his expression made her breath catch before she looked away with a blush. And when she rose and turned back toward the festivities, she reached for his hand in a gesture so natural and unthinking that she did not realize what she had done until their fingers were already touching. And then she froze and began to pull away as though she had overstepped some boundary that still existed between them. But Christopher caught her hand before she could withdraw it completely and held it gently in his own, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a caress that was tender and deliberate. And when she looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, he said softly that she could hold his hand if she wished, that she never needed permission to touch him, that he would welcome any gesture of affection she chose to offer. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears even as she smiled, and she nodded without words because her throat was too tight for speech, and they walked through the rest of the fair hand in hand, while the village watched and whispered that perhaps the Earl's marriage was not the cold arrangement they had imagined, after all. And the day after the village fair marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in Christopher's behavior, as though the moment of holding Eleanor's hand in public had given him permission to pursue something he had been holding back. And in the days that followed, he began courting his own wife with a deliberation and tenderness that left her both bewildered and cautiously hopeful. She woke one morning to find a small bouquet of wildflowers outside her door, the kind that grew near the stream where Christopher had fished as a boy, and though no note accompanied them, she knew they were from him, and felt her heart quicken at the gesture. The next day she discovered a book on her bedside table, a volume of poetry she had mentioned admiring during one of their conversations in the library, and when she opened it, she found a ribbon marking a particular poem about second chances and redemption that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. Christopher began appearing at odd hours with invitations that felt both formal and intimate, asking if she would care to walk with him in the garden or join him for a private dinner in the smaller dining room rather than the echoing formality of the main hall. And Eleanor found herself accepting these offerings with less hesitation each time, drawn by the genuine warmth in his expression and the careful attention he paid to her comfort and preferences. Their conversations during these shared times deepened in ways that surprised them both, moving beyond the tentative exchanges of their earlier reconciliation into discussions of philosophy and politics, of dreams deferred and hopes rekindled, of the kind of life they might build together if they could truly move beyond the bitterness that had brought them to this unlikely union. Christopher discovered that Eleanor possessed not just kindness, but a sharp intelligence and a dry wit that emerged when she felt safe enough to lower her guard. And he found himself genuinely enchanted by the way her mind worked, the connections she made, the insights she offered that challenged his assumptions and made him reconsider views he had held without examination. Eleanor in turn saw layers to Christopher she had not imagined existed beneath his cold exterior, depths of feeling and thoughtfulness that his hurt and anger had buried but not destroyed. And she began to understand that the man he had been when they married was not the man he truly was, but rather a wounded version of himself that love and patience were slowly healing. Yet despite this growing connection and the clear affection that was developing between them, a physical distance remained that both acknowledged without words a boundary that Eleanor was not yet ready to cross and that Christopher would not push her toward. Each evening when they parted, she still retreated to her chambers, and each night the sound of the lock turning still echoed in the quiet hallway. But now Christopher stood outside her door, not in anguish, but in patient waiting, believing that the time would come when that barrier would fall, and knowing that when it did, the opening would be Eleanor's choice made freely and without fear, and that the waiting itself was part of the transformation that was remaking them both into people worthy of the love that was slowly but undeniably blooming between them. 2 months into their marriage, on an evening when summer had fully settled over the countryside and the long twilight painted everything in shades of gold and rose, Christopher and Eleanor sat together in the smaller drawing room, sharing wine and conversation that had flowed with an ease that would have seemed impossible in those first bitter weeks, and Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely at a story Christopher told about his childhood misadventures with a particularly stubborn pony, her face alight with the kind of unguarded joy that made Christopher's heart constrict with a mixture of love and regret for all the happiness he had nearly destroyed before it could begin. When the hour grew late and the candles burned low, Christopher rose and offered his hand to Eleanor, a gesture that had become their evening ritual, and together they climbed the stairs to the corridor where their chambers stood opposite each other, like sentinels guarding separate territories that had once been enemy positions, but now felt more like neighboring kingdoms on the verge of alliance. At her door, Eleanor paused and turned to face him, expecting the usual gentle good night and the soft kiss on her forehead that had become his habit, but Christopher kept her hand in his, and she saw something different in his expression tonight, a vulnerability mixed with determination that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and something very close to fear. He spoke her name softly and said he must ask her something, and Eleanor felt herself tense instinctively, even as her hand remained in his, her other hand moving to the door handle in a gesture that had become so automatic over these weeks that she hardly noticed she did it until she felt the cool metal under her palm and realized she was already preparing to retreat into the safety of her locked sanctuary. Christopher saw the movement and the tension in her posture, but he did not release her hand, instead holding it gently while he asked in a voice that was both hopeful and resigned whether she might consider not locking her door tonight, hastening to add that he would not enter and had no expectation or demand to make, but only wished to know that the barrier was not there between them, that she trusted him enough to leave the door unlocked even if he never crossed the threshold. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the request, because it seemed such a small thing, and yet it was enormous. The difference between a door that was merely closed and one that was locked, being the difference between privacy and fortress, between caution and fear, and she found herself torn between the genuine affection and growing trust she felt for Christopher, and the deeper terror that still lived in her heart. The fear that had been planted on their wedding day when she learned she had been married for revenge, and watered by every cold word and distant look in those early weeks until it had grown roots too deep to pull out easily. She looked at Christopher and saw the patience in his eyes and the love that had been growing there day by day. Saw the man who had courted her with wild flowers and poetry and gentle conversation, who had defended her against her father's cruelty and held her while she wept, who had transformed himself from the bitter, wounded creature who had spoken vows with ice in his voice into this tender soul who stood before her now asking for nothing but a symbol of trust, and still she could not give it. Not yet. Not tonight. Her voice was barely a whisper when she told him she needed more time, that she was not yet ready to leave that door unlocked, and she saw the disappointment flicker across his face before he mastered it and replaced it with understanding. And when he told her that he would wait as long as she needed, that he would wait forever if necessary, because she was worth any amount of patience, she felt tears sting her eyes at the gentleness of his acceptance. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it with a tenderness that made her heart ache, the first truly intimate touch he had offered, beyond the holding of hands and occasional brush of fingers, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his mouth on her skin like a brand that marked her as belonging to him, even as she continued to hold him at arm's length behind her locked door. The pattern established itself over the following weeks with a rhythm that became as familiar as breathing, each evening following the same careful choreography that both marked their growing closeness and acknowledged the boundary Eleanor was not yet ready to cross. Christopher would escort Eleanor to her chambers after they had spent the evening together in conversation or quiet companionship, their time together growing longer each night as they found more to share and less reason to part. And when they reached her door, he would pause and hold her hand and ask in a voice that never held pressure or demand whether tonight she might leave her door unlocked. And each night, Eleanor would feel her heart pull in two directions at once, toward the trust that was growing stronger daily and away from the fear that still lived in her bones. And she would tell him gently that she needed more time, and he would accept her refusal with a grace that made her love him more even as she continued to hold him at a distance. What Eleanor did not know, what Christopher did not tell her, was that after he bid her good night, and she disappeared into her chambers, and he heard the soft but definitive click of the lock sliding into place, he did not retreat to his own rooms, but instead returned to stand outside her door in the quiet hallway where the shadows gathered thick, and the silence was broken only by the settling of the old house around them. He stood there in the darkness and spoke to the wooden barrier between them, his voice low and soft, words meant for her ears if she chose to listen, but offered freely even if she never heard them. Confessions of his wrongdoing and admissions of his transformation, acknowledgments of how profoundly she had changed him from the bitter man who had married her for revenge into someone who barely recognized the person he had been just months before. He told the closed door that he had been wrong to punish her for sins that were not hers, that she had shown him what true goodness looked like through her kindness to servants and tenants, through her patience with his coldness, through the quiet dignity she maintained even when she had every right to rage or despair. He told the silent wood that she was the best person he had ever known, that her worth was beyond measure, that her supposed plainness was a fiction invented by shallow people who could not see the radiance that blazed from her spirit and made her beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the arrangement of her features. He told the locked door that he did not deserve her forgiveness, but he hoped for it, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the gift of her presence in his world, that she had transformed his darkness into light, and his anger into something that felt remarkably like peace. Inside her chambers, Eleanor sat with her back against that same door, separated from Christopher by mere inches of oak, and by the chasm of hurt that was slowly but steadily narrowing. And she listened to every word he spoke, her tears flowing silently down her cheeks as she heard the love and regret and hope in his voice. And though she was not yet ready to open the door, she found herself beginning to believe that perhaps one day she would be, that the man speaking these truths in the darkness was not the man who had married her with ice in his voice, but someone new, someone real, someone she was learning to love despite everything, and that love was both terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The arrival of Lord Victor Whitmore at Ashworth Manor came without warning on a grey afternoon in late summer, when the air hung heavy with the promise of storms, and Eleanor was working in the morning room on correspondence to tenants who had written requesting assistance with various needs. Her careful attention to their concerns, yet another manifestation of the compassion that had so completely transformed Christopher's understanding of what it meant to be worthy. The butler appeared with obvious discomfort to announce that Lord Whitmore demanded an immediate audience with the Earl, and Eleanor felt her stomach turn to ice at the mention of her father's name. All the old fear and shame rising up despite the security she had begun to feel in her new life. And when Christopher entered the morning room moments later to inform her of the visitor, his face was already set in hard lines of controlled anger, though his voice remained gentle when he asked if she wished to be present for the interview. Eleanor found herself nodding, even though every instinct screamed to hide in her chambers, because she knew that whatever happened, she could no longer live as the frightened creature who scurried away from confrontation, and together they entered the drawing-room, where Victor Whitmore stood examining the valuable paintings and furnishings with the appraising eye of a merchant calculating worth, and his greeting to his daughter was perfunctory and cold, while his address to Christopher dripped with false cordiality that fooled no one. He wasted little time on pleasantries before launching into the purpose of his visit, detailing with shameless candor the debts that now threatened to destroy him completely, and demanding that Christopher use his influence and connections to save him from ruin, speaking as though this was the Earl's obligation rather than a favor being requested, as though the marriage he had arranged entitled him to unlimited access to his son-in-law's resources and power. Christopher listened in silence that grew more dangerous with each passing moment. His body utterly still, in the way Eleanor had learned, meant he was exercising tremendous control over rage that wanted expression, and when Victor paused in his demands, Christopher's response was a simple question about what made Whitmore believe he deserved such assistance, given the history between their families. Victor's face flushed red with anger at this unexpected resistance, and he gestured dismissively toward Eleanor, saying that surely the fact that Christopher had gotten Victor's daughter in the bargain was payment enough, adding with casual cruelty that at least her plain face had bought him an earl for a son-in-law, even if she had proven useless in securing her husband's goodwill. And Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, all the old poison flooding back, the familiar message that her only value lay in what she could be traded for, and that even in that transaction she had been a disappointing commodity. But before she could retreat into the protective numbness that had been her shield for so many years, Christopher moved with swift fury, crossing the room to stand between Eleanor and her father, and when he spoke, his voice was cold fire that burned with righteous rage, ordering Victor from his house immediately and adding words that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, that her father was blind and unworthy because Eleanor's worth was beyond any measure Whitmore could comprehend, that her face was beautiful because her soul was beautiful, that she was worth 1,000 of him, and that he would not pollute her presence with his venomous cruelty for one moment longer. He personally escorted the sputtering, protesting Victor to the entrance, and saw him forcibly removed from the estate, with instructions to the staff that Lord Whitmore was never to be admitted again under any circumstances, and when Christopher returned to the drawing-room, he found Eleanor collapsed on the settee, weeping with great, shuddering sobs that came from a place deeper than the present moment, all the years of her father's dismissal and cruelty finally finding release. Christopher gathered her into his arms for the first time with true physical intimacy, holding her against his chest while she cried, one hand cradling her head and the other wrapped around her trembling shoulders. And he murmured into her hair that she was precious beyond measure, that she should never doubt her worth, that he would spend the rest of his life showing her how profoundly valuable she was. And Eleanor clung to him and wept and felt something break open inside her that had been locked away even longer than the door to her chambers. The days following the confrontation with her father brought a transformation to Eleanor's world that felt almost dreamlike in its profound departure from everything she had known in the months since her wedding. As Christopher's protective fury on her behalf seemed to have broken through some final barrier in his own heart and allowed him to express freely what had been building for weeks beneath the surface of restrained courtesy and careful courtship. He sought her company now with an openness that bordered on eagerness, appearing at her side throughout the day to walk with her through the estate grounds that were taking on the golden colors of approaching autumn, to sit with her in the library where their conversations ranged across every subject from literature to philosophy to the practical matters of estate management, which he increasingly discussed with her as though her opinions held genuine weight and value. The words he had spoken to her father, the declaration that her face was beautiful because her soul was beautiful, seemed to have liberated Christopher to speak his admiration and growing affection without restraint, and hardly an hour passed without him finding some way to express his respect for her intelligence, or his appreciation for her kindness, or his wonder at how completely she had transformed not only his household, but his very understanding of what it meant to live with purpose beyond bitterness. Eleanor found herself blooming under this steady sunshine of genuine appreciation in ways she had never imagined possible, as though some part of her that had been locked away even longer than the door to her chambers was finally beginning to unfold and reach toward the light, and she caught herself smiling without reason and humming as she arranged flowers and feeling a lightness in her chest that she gradually recognized as something approaching happiness. The staff noticed the change in both the Earl and his Countess, their whispered conversations in corridors and kitchens now filled with satisfaction rather than pity, as they observed how Lord Ashworth looked at his wife with unmistakable tenderness, and how Lady Ashworth no longer moved through the manor like a ghost trying not to disturb the living, but walked with increasing confidence and grace. Mrs. Dalton smiled with particular knowing satisfaction whenever she observed the couple together, her wise old eyes reflecting the pleasure of one who had hoped for precisely this outcome, and now saw her hopes bearing fruit beyond even her optimistic expectations. The evening walks became a cherished tradition, with Christopher and Eleanor strolling through the gardens as the light faded and the air cooled, and during these quiet hours Christopher shared with Eleanor his hopes for the estate and for the life they might build together, his regrets about the bitterness that had consumed him for so long and nearly destroyed his chance at happiness, his dreams of becoming the kind of man his mother would have been proud of, rather than the vengeful creature his father's death had created. Eleanor in turn found herself sharing pieces of her own heart that she had protected for so long, speaking of her childhood, loneliness and her resignation to being unearthed, and her secret dreams that she had believed would never find fulfillment, and with each confidence exchanged, the walls between them grew lower, and the connection between them grew stronger and more real. The evening in late September arrived with the particular quality of light that belongs only to early autumn, when the sun takes on a golden hue that transforms everything it touches into something precious and temporary, and Christopher had suggested they take their evening tea in the library, where a fire had been laid against the growing chill that came with darkness. And Eleanor found herself watching him as he poured her tea with careful attention to the way she preferred it. 2 lumps of sugar and a generous measure of cream. This small knowledge that he had acquired about her preferences feeling like a tender gift in itself. They had spent the afternoon riding to the far boundaries of the estate, where repairs were being made to tenant cottages damaged in recent storms, and Eleanor had watched Christopher speak with the families with a kindness that would have seemed impossible in the cold, distant man who had stood beside her at their wedding just 3 months prior, and she felt her heart expanding with feelings that both terrified and exhilarated her, because she recognized them as the dangerous territory of love. The fire crackled and sent dancing shadows across the thousands of books that lined the walls, and they sat in companionable silence for a time, before Christopher set down his cup and turned to face her with an expression that held both determination and vulnerability. And Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat because she had learned to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor that signaled moments of significance. Christopher reached across the small space between their chairs and took both of her hands in his touch warm and steady. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of words that had been carefully considered and deeply felt, telling her that he must speak plainly because he could no longer contain what had been building in his heart for weeks now, that he had fallen in love with his wife, and that this truth was both the greatest joy and the deepest shame of his life. Eleanor's breath stopped entirely as he continued speaking, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made looking away impossible even as tears began to blur her vision, and he told her that he had married her for revenge, but that he would marry her 1,000 times over for love, that she had transformed his bitterness into hope and his anger into peace, that every day with her revealed new depths of goodness and intelligence and grace that made him wonder how he had been so blind as to see her as anything other than a gift beyond his deserving. The tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks as she listened to this declaration that rewrote the entire foundation of their union, and when she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper, confessing that she wanted to believe him, but that she was afraid that the wounds of their beginning had cut deep and that trust felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, with only his word to keep her from falling. Christopher's hands tightened on hers, and his own eyes grew bright with unshed tears as he acknowledged the justice of her fear, admitting that he had given her every reason to doubt and to protect herself, but promising with a solemnity that felt like a sacred vow that he would spend the rest of his life proving that his love was real and worthy of her trust, that he would be patient and persistent and present until she could believe without reservation that she was cherished beyond measure. He did not ask about the door, did not press for any commitment or response beyond what she could freely give. And this restraint in the face of his obvious longing moved Eleanor perhaps more than the declaration itself, because it demonstrated that his love was not about his own needs, but about her healing and her choice. The weeks that followed Christopher's declaration of love took on a quality of tender intensity that transformed the daily rhythms of life at Ashworth Manor into something that felt like the careful unfolding of a flower that had been tightly closed against the frost and was now slowly opening its petals to the warmth of unexpected spring, as Christopher's courtship of his own wife intensified in ways both subtle and unmistakable, while maintaining always the respectful boundaries that demonstrated his love was about Eleanor's comfort rather than his own desires. The stolen glances that had marked their earlier tentative connection became lingering eye contact across dinner tables and drawing rooms, moments when their eyes would meet and hold with an understanding that needed no words to convey the depth of feeling flowing between them. And Eleanor found herself no longer looking away in confusion or fear, but meeting his gaze with growing confidence in what she saw reflected there. The held hands that had been such a significant milestone at the village fair became arms comfortably linked as they walked through the estate grounds in the golden light of early autumn afternoons. Christopher's arm warm and solid beneath her touch, and Eleanor's fingers resting naturally in the crook of his elbow with a sense of rightness that spoke of belonging rather than obligation. The chaste kisses he had pressed to her hand with such reverence became soft kisses on her forehead as he bid her good night at her chamber door. His lips warm against her skin and lingering just long enough to make her heart race with feelings that were no longer frightening but rather intoxicating in their promise of deeper intimacy to come. Eleanor felt her fear slowly melting under the steady warmth of this genuine love, much as winter ice melts under persistent sunshine. The hard protective shell she had built around her wounded heart growing thinner and more transparent with each day that Christopher proved his devotion through patient action rather than empty words. And she caught herself leaning into his touches and seeking his company, and smiling at the mere thought of him in ways that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. But still, despite this deepening connection and growing trust, each night when the hour grew late, Eleanor found herself following the pattern that had become both protection and prison, her hand reaching automatically for the key to lock her chamber door because some habits of self-preservation ran too deep to be released all at once, and the sound of that lock clicking into place still brought a complex mixture of safety and sorrow that she could not quite overcome despite her conscious desire to trust completely. Christopher, for his part, continued his own nightly ritual, standing outside her door in the quiet darkness of the sleeping house, though now his vigil had transformed from desperate, silent pleading into something more peaceful and patient, an act of loving witness rather than anguished petition. And he would rest his hand gently against the wood that separated them and speak softly enough that she could choose whether to hear him or not, saying simply the words that had become his evening prayer, telling her that he loved her and wishing her peaceful rest. And from inside her locked chamber, Eleanor would press her own hand against the door as though she could touch his through the barrier between them, and she would whisper back so quietly that he could not hear, but she needed to say, speaking his name like a benediction, and returning his good night with a tenderness that grew stronger with each passing evening. The 4 months since their wedding in May had transformed the world from grey spring into the golden abundance of early October, and this particular day had possessed a quality of perfection that seemed almost deliberately designed to demonstrate how far they had travelled from the cold morning when Eleanor had stood beside a stranger and promised her life to him without hope or expectation of happiness. They had ridden together to the farthest reaches of the estate, where the land rose to meet the ancient forest that marked the boundary of Ashworth property, and they had dismounted to walk among the trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn from green to the brilliant reds and golds that would soon carpet the ground beneath their feet. And they had talked and laughed with the easy intimacy of people who had discovered in each other not just affection, but genuine friendship that made every conversation feel like the sharing of treasures. Eleanor had found herself studying Christopher's profile as he spoke about his plans for new drainage systems in the lower fields, and she had been struck by the realization that she loved not just the tenderness he showed her, or the patience with which he had courted her trust, but the entirety of who he was, including his serious dedication to his responsibilities and his dry humor that emerged unexpectedly to make her laugh, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at her, as though she were the source of light in his world. The afternoon had stretched into evening as they returned to the manor and took their dinner in the small dining room rather than the formal hall. Sitting close together at one end of the long table and lingering over their meal, not because the food demanded such attention, but because neither wished to end the day that had felt like a gift. When at last the hour grew late, and Christopher walked with her through the quiet corridors toward her chambers, as had become their nightly ritual, Eleanor felt something shifting inside her like ice breaking free from the riverbank when spring finally arrives in earnest, a sense that the fear she had clung to for protection had become less a shield than a prison, keeping her from the very happiness she had come to want with desperate intensity. They reached her door, and Christopher turned to face her with that expression of tender devotion that still had the power to steal her breath. And he lifted his hand to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to weep. And he told her in a voice rough with emotion that he loved her, and that this day had been one of the happiest of his life. He leaned down to press his lips against her forehead in the chaste kiss that had become his nightly benediction. And then he stepped back to bid her good night, and turned to walk away toward his own chambers. And Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest as she watched him preparing to leave. Her voice emerged before conscious thought could form the words, calling his name with an urgency that stopped him immediately and brought him turning back to face her with hope and fear warring in his grey eyes that had once been so cold and were now windows into a heart she had come to trust. Her hand trembled visibly as it rested on the door handle, and she drew a shaking breath before speaking the truth that terrified and liberated her in equal measure, confessing that she was still afraid because fear had become such a familiar companion that releasing it felt like losing part of herself, but acknowledging that she was far more afraid of locking out the love she had come to feel for him, a love that had grown from the smallest seed of hope into something that filled every corner of her heart and made the thought of keeping barriers between them more painful than the risk of vulnerability. Eleanor's voice emerged stronger now as she continued speaking the truth that had been gathering inside her through all these weeks of watching Christopher prove himself worthy of the trust he asked for. Telling him that she loved him despite everything that had happened between them, and perhaps even because of everything, because the journey from that cold, grey morning in May to this golden October evening had shown her that people could change in fundamental ways when they opened themselves to transformation, that love could grow from the hardest and most unlikely soil when it was tended with patience and genuine care. She watched his face as she spoke, and saw the hope dawning there like sunfreeze breaking over distant hills, and she felt her own courage rising to meet this moment that she had both feared and longed for through all the lonely nights when she had listened to him speaking softly through the barrier she had placed between them. Her hand moved with deliberate slowness as she turned the handle and pushed open the door to her chambers, leaving it standing wide in a gesture that carried more significance than any words could convey, and she met his eyes as she told him that she would not lock her door tonight or ever again, that the barrier she had needed for protection had become an obstacle to the happiness she now wanted more than safety. She saw his breath catch, and his eyes fill with tears that he did not try to hide, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion barely contained as he told her something that made her love him even more deeply than she already did. He said that he would not enter her chambers tonight, despite her invitation, that he wished only to know the door stood open between them, and that when he finally crossed that threshold, it would be at her explicit request rather than merely her permission, because he wanted no shadow of coercion or obligation to touch the intimacy they would one day share. The tenderness in his words made her eyes blur with tears of gratitude and wonder that this man who had once been so cold and cruel could have become someone capable of such delicate consideration for her feelings. And when he stepped closer and cupped her face between his hands with infinite gentleness, she felt her heart opening even further to receive the love he was offering. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. And when she remained still and waiting, He brushed his lips across hers in a kiss that was soft and chaste, yet carried within it the promise of deeper passion held carefully in check by his respect for her pace and readiness. The touch of his mouth against hers sent warmth flooding through her body and made her sway slightly toward him before he stepped back with visible effort, and he told her to sleep well and called her his precious wife in a tone that made both words feel like vows renewed and deepened. Eleanor watched him walk away down the corridor toward his own chambers, and for the first time since their wedding night, she did not close her door and turn the key in the lock, but instead left it standing open as she prepared for bed. And she fell asleep more peacefully than she had in months, knowing that the barrier between them had finally been removed by her own choice and courage. Christopher, for his part, returned to his chambers with a heart so full of joy and relief and grateful love that he could barely comprehend the transformation that had occurred. And that night he did not stand outside her door in his familiar vigil, but instead slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since bringing his unwilling bride to Ashworth Manor, and he woke in the morning with hope singing through his veins like bird song, welcoming the dawn. The weeks that followed the night Eleanor left her door unlocked transformed their marriage into something neither of them had dared to imagine, during those cold, early days when silence and resentment had filled the halls of Ashworth Manor, and the change was visible not only in the way they spoke to each other with growing tenderness, but in how their bodies had learned to communicate affection through gestures that grew steadily less tentative and more certain with each passing day. Christopher no longer hesitated to reach for Eleanor's hand when they walked together through the gardens or the village, and he had begun to rest his hand at the small of her back when they stood speaking with tenants or tradesmen, a possessive yet gentle touch that proclaimed to anyone watching that he cherished his wife and wished the world to know it. Eleanor, in turn, had grown bold enough to lean into his side when they sat together in the library during the long evenings, her head sometimes coming to rest against his shoulder as he read aloud from whatever book they had selected, and she had discovered that she loved the sound of his voice when it was relaxed and warm rather than cold and clipped as it had been in those first terrible weeks. Their kisses had evolved from the chaste brush of lips that had marked their first real kiss into something deeper and more passionate, moments when Christopher would cup her face in his hands and kiss her with a hunger barely restrained by his determination to let her set the pace of their physical intimacy. And Eleanor found herself responding with equal passion that surprised and delighted her because she had never imagined her own capacity for desire. She would feel heat flooding through her body when he kissed her and pull him closer rather than drawing away, and she noticed how his breathing would quicken and his hands would tremble slightly as he held himself in check. And she loved him even more for the restraint he showed, even as she found herself wishing he would cast restraint aside. The staff had certainly noticed the transformation and whispered among themselves about how the Earl looked at his Countess as though she were the most beautiful woman in England, and how her ladyship glowed with happiness that made her plain features somehow lovely, and Mrs. Dalton smiled her knowing smile and said nothing, but ensured that the Countess's chambers were kept perfectly appointed and that fresh flowers appeared there daily. One evening in late October, after they had dined together in the small dining room and lingered over their wine, talking about nothing and everything, Eleanor felt her courage gathering like a wave preparing to break upon the shore, and when Christopher rose to escort her to her chambers, as had become their nightly ritual, she took his hand and held it perhaps a bit more tightly than usual. They walked through the quiet corridors together and reached her door, and instead of the usual tender good night, Eleanor kept hold of his hand and looked up into his face and asked him in a voice that trembled only slightly whether he would come to her chambers that night, truly come and stay, rather than simply knowing the door stood open. She watched his expression transform from surprise to joy, so profound it made her eyes sting with tears, and he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with reverence that made her feel precious beyond measure. And he told her that it would be his greatest honor to come to her as her husband in every sense of that word. Christopher led Eleanor into her chambers with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the most wonderful way, and he closed the door softly behind them before turning to face her with eyes that held such reverence. She felt beautiful for the first time in her entire life, despite the mirror having always told her otherwise. He approached her slowly, as though she were something infinitely precious that might shatter if handled carelessly. And when he reached up to cup her face between his hands, she leaned into his touch and closed her eyes and felt the last remaining wall around her heart crumble into dust beneath the weight of his love. He kissed her with a gentleness that gradually deepened into passion as she responded to him without fear or hesitation, her hands sliding up his chest and around his neck to pull him closer, and she felt his surprise and delight at her boldness, and it made her smile against his lips. Christopher drew back slightly to search her face and asked her if she was certain this was what she wanted, and she loved him even more for asking, even though her invitation had been clear, and she told him that she had never been more certain of anything in her life than her desire to be truly his wife in every sense of that sacred word. He undressed her with infinite patience and care, his hands trembling slightly as he unfastened each button and untied each ribbon, and he whispered against her skin that she was beautiful and precious and beloved until she almost believed the words herself. Eleanor had expected to feel embarrassment or shame at her nakedness, given all the years she had been taught that her body was something to apologize for, but instead she felt only the warmth of his admiration and desire as his gaze moved over her with wonder that seemed entirely genuine. When Christopher carried her to the bed and laid her down upon it with reverent care, she reached up to draw him down beside her and helped him remove his own clothing with hands that grew bolder as his breathing quickened and his control visibly frayed. Their joining was tender and patient despite the hunger they both felt, because Christopher was determined to ensure her comfort and pleasure, even as his own need threatened to overwhelm his restraint. And Eleanor discovered sensations and emotions she had never imagined herself capable of experiencing, as he loved her with his body, as thoroughly as he had already claimed her heart. Afterward they lay tangled together in the lamplight, with her head resting on his chest and his arms wrapped securely around her, and the silence between them was filled with contentment so deep that words seemed unnecessary until Christopher finally spoke. He told her that he had stood outside her locked door every single night since their wedding, and that he had been silently begging for forgiveness and for a chance to prove himself worthy of her love. And Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she admitted that she had known, that she had heard him through the barrier she had needed until she could trust what her heart was telling her. Christopher asked her if she believed now, and she tilted her face up to look into his eyes as she told him that she believed completely, and that she was his just as he was hers. And when he kissed her again, it tasted of salt from their mingled tears, and of joy so profound it felt almost like pain, and they held each other through the night, as though they might never let go. Spring arrived at Ashworth Manor 2 years after that cold grey morning in May, when Eleanor Whitmore had married Lord Christopher Ashworth in a transaction meant to serve revenge rather than love. And the transformation that had occurred in the intervening time was visible in every aspect of the estate and its inhabitants, from the gardens that bloomed with vibrant abundance to the halls that rang with laughter rather than echoing with cold silence, to the faces of the staff who served a couple so evidently devoted to one another that even the most cynical among them had softened into romantic sentimentality. Eleanor stood among the rose bushes on a warm April afternoon, with her hands resting on the pronounced swell of her belly, where their first child grew and would arrive in perhaps 2 months if the doctor's calculations proved accurate, and she was examining the new blooms with the critical eye of someone who had transformed these neglected beds into something worthy of the passion Christopher's mother had once lavished upon them. She did not hear her husband approach until his arms slid around her waist from behind, and his hands came to rest over hers on the place where their baby moved and kicked with increasing vigor, and his chin settled onto her shoulder as he pulled her back against his chest, with the easy intimacy of a man who knew himself beloved and had no fear of rejection. Eleanor leaned into his embrace with a contentment so deep it still sometimes surprised her when she remembered those early months of locked doors and locked hearts, and Christopher pressed a kiss to the side of her neck before asking her softly if she remembered when she had locked him out of her chambers and out of her life with such determination, born of self-protection and wounded pride. Eleanor laughed and tilted her head to look at him as she asked in return whether he remembered standing outside that locked door night after night, like some lovesick fool, begging silently for a forgiveness and a chance he had not yet earned but desperately wanted. And they both laughed together at the memory, because time and love had transformed pain into something they could acknowledge without being consumed by it. The locked door had become part of their story, rather than its definition. A chapter they had moved beyond but would never forget, because it had taught them both the value of patience and the possibility of redemption, and the truth that love could indeed grow from the hardest and most unlikely soil if tended with genuine care. Eleanor turned in his arms to face him properly and told him that she would do it all again if she knew it would lead her to this moment, in this garden, with this man and this child growing between them. And Christopher cupped her face between his hands, the way he had done on that first night when he had loved her with reverence and patience, and told her that he would do it all differently if given the chance, because he regretted every moment of pain he had caused her. But he thanked God every single day that his misguided quest for revenge had somehow led him to the greatest blessing of his life. The village respected them now, and the staff adored them, and the estate thrived under their joint stewardship. And Eleanor had discovered that genuine love and appreciation could indeed make a woman beautiful, regardless of what her mirror might have once told her about the plainness of her features, because Christopher looked at her as though she were the most stunning creature ever created, and his gaze had taught her to see herself through his eyes, rather than through the cruel assessments of her father or society. Dear listener, this story of Eleanor and Christopher is not merely a tale of two people who found love in the most unlikely circumstances, but rather it is a story about all of us and the barriers we construct around our wounded hearts to protect ourselves from further pain. And perhaps as you listened, you recognized something of yourself in Eleanor's locked door or in Christopher's patient vigil outside it, because we all carry within us rooms we have sealed off from the world after betrayal or disappointment has taught us that vulnerability leads only to suffering. The locked door in this story is a symbol of the walls we build when we have been hurt by those who should have protected us, when we have been used as instruments of someone else's ambition or revenge, when we have been told by the world or by our own families that we are not enough and never will be. Eleanor locked her door because she understood with painful clarity that she had been reduced to a transaction, a tool for her father's financial salvation and her husband's vengeance. And in that single act of turning the key, she claimed the only power available to her in circumstances where she had no real choice about the shape of her life. But this story is equally about Christopher standing on the other side of that locked door night after night, wrestling with guilt and growing love, learning that revenge tastes like ashes and that the person he had meant to punish was innocent of the crimes he had sought to avenge. And his vigil teaches us that when we have caused harm, even unintentionally or in pursuit of what we believed was justice. The path to redemption requires patience and humility, and the willingness to wait as long as necessary for trust to be rebuilt. The greatest love stories often begin in the darkest places, and sometimes the people who hurt us can indeed transform into people who heal us, though we must be wise enough to recognize the difference between genuine change demonstrated through consistent action and empty promises that dissolve under scrutiny. Not everyone who stands outside your locked door deserves to have it opened, and not every locked door should remain sealed forever, and the wisdom lies in discerning which is which through careful observation of whether words align with deeds over time. Your locked door may look different from Eleanor's, perhaps manifesting as emotional unavailability or reluctance to trust or walls built so high that no one can scale them, and your pain may have different roots than hers, but the invitation this story extends remains the same regardless of your particular circumstances. Be brave enough to unlock your door when love proves itself true through patience and respect and genuine change, and be patient enough to stand outside someone else's locked door if you have been the cause of their pain and truly wish to make amends. Change is possible even when bitterness has calcified into identity. Love is possible even when hope seems naive. And new beginnings are always possible, regardless of how old you are or how long you have lived behind locked doors, because Eleanor was 24 and considered herself a spinster resigned to lovelessness. Yet she found profound joy when she found the courage to risk vulnerability again. Thank you for listening to Eleanor's story and Christopher's redemption and their journey from revenge to love. And if this tale touched your heart, please subscribe for more stories of love conquering against all odds and transforming even the most unlikely circumstances into beauty. Until next time, dear listener, may you find the courage to unlock your doors when love proves itself worthy. And may you have the wisdom to recognize when that moment has arrived.